Hi there, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's video is a second part. They go hand in hand with the video I did yesterday, in which I discussed and demonstrated how we can use Google's REST API to send emails. So today we're going to discuss how we can use Microsoft's REST API, their Graph API, to send emails again. So we're going to be using a specific API out of the lot to interact and deal with mail. But as I had mentioned yesterday, the ecosystem for Microsoft is huge, and you can go well beyond just plain emails. You can, well, you're going to see in a second just some of the different APIs that are available to you to interact with all sorts of aspects of your Microsoft ecosystem. So a lot of this is going to be very similar, not identical, but very similar. And it all comes down to, we have to first set up the online information. So you have to set up an online account, and then you get over to the VBA where you use the information that you've set up to configure your VBA, so then it can do what it needs to do. So the first part of this, which hopefully won't take too long, is going to be setting up the application online. So we have to go into our Microsoft account through a special portal, the Entra portal, and there we have to create an entry for an application. So in this case, it's going to be my Access database, and this is where we set up we're going to get a client ID. This is what we need to be able to communicate initially. And then we're going to also assign the different APIs we want access to, or we want our application to have access to. Because just because we register an application, it doesn't give it access to the ecosystem. We have to first go and specify what it's allowed to work with. So just by setting up your application through the web portal doesn't mean it can go do whatever it wants. You still have complete control at the security level as to which APIs, which aspects an application will have access to. So even if someone were to gain access to my VBA code, and they may be able to, let's say, interact with certain aspects, so in this case, let's say sending mail, they wouldn't necessarily, because I haven't set up the APIs for it, be able to go nose around in my files, be able to go nose around in my contacts, my calendar. All of those things wouldn't even work. Beyond which, for any of this to work anyway, they have to be able to authenticate, so they need to know my email address and my password to begin with. So let's just take a glance at setting up the initial account. So if you go to Entra, so it's entra.microsoft.com, I created an account yesterday, just a generalized Hotmail account, and I'm just going to demonstrate how this works. And you're going to come in. Now I already have one. I'm going to delete it. We're going to start over from scratch. So I'm going to come here into Applications, Registrations, and I'm going to select this guy, and let's delete it. Where is it? Delete. Yes, I understand, and it's gone. Now, so right off the bat, let's start as if we had just logged in fresh. You have nothing. So we're going to create an application registration. We're going to enter a new application. So I'm going to associate with my account. It's astounding how complicated Microsoft can make things, and the contrast to Google, for instance, where all these pop-ups, these things changing, and you have to create some type of folder, and I don't know what any of this is. I'm not even getting into it. For right now, I do this, anyway. Yeah. It is amazing to me sometimes how complicated Microsoft makes something that should be so simple become. But we just click on this, we move forward. You have to give it a name. So what happens here is you can create multiple applications, right? So here you just want to give it a name that's going to be distinguishable for you. So if ever you have to come back and change things, add new APIs perhaps, well, that you're able to easily identify which application is which. This is all it is. So it's a unique name. We don't use it in any other capacity. It's not included. It's not necessary in any of our application configuration outside of here. So you can just do whatever you want. REST API testing, let's say, and I'm going to call it its multi-tenant. And here we need to define a redirect URI. So I'm going to do HTTP, and localhost. So I'm telling it that the application, when we make a request, will redirect to the local host, which means the local computer making the request. Now, what's going to happen here is my computer is not a web server. So when it's going to make that request, it will fail. But I'm making it fail intentionally so then I can extract information from the redirect URL, and then we're able to continue with the authentication. So this is all done intentionally. But we just register this. It does what it needs to do to create the instance. And the important part here is it now has created for us an application ID. So we need this. So we're going to copy it. And we're going to go into my VBA for the demo database. And we're going to paste that guy right in here on the mod Microsoft. So with this, it's the beginning of the authentication process. So once that's done, we're not done. Okay, we've created the instance or the permission, but we haven't assigned any actual APIs to this application. So it currently may exist, but it has no permissions yet to do anything, to access anything. So we have to come down to API permissions. And by default, as you can see, you have user read. We need to add more to that. And it depends on what you want your system to do. So today we're talking about sending emails. So we're working with mail. So we're going to come here, add permission. We're going to go Graph API. But as you can see, there are tons of other REST APIs you can use depending on what you'd like to do. You want to work with OneNote? There you go. Power Automate, Dynamic 365. So as you can see, there are many, many other APIs you can connect to do all sorts of things. But for mail, Outlook Mail, we use the Microsoft Graph. So we click here, delegated or application. It depends on what you're doing. For today's demo, I'm going to use delegated. And then here you can come and you have different options. So these are all the different permission subjects. So, analytics, if you want to get into that, you want to get into audit log. Anyway, you get an idea here. Calendars, chat. Anyway, it's all here. So, we're talking about something very specific, but you can even make this into an IT admin tool. You could create a database for IT admin where they can access Active Directory information, user roles and rosters and things like that. You can work with files. Anyway, and this is just specifically the Graph API. Like I said, you want to access other things, Dynamics 365 will use that API, and then you're going to have a whole slew of other permissions. For us today, we're coming to mail, and I'm going to pick the send, the read write. I'm also going to come back up here because I know I need one other one. I'm going to add the offline access. So I'm going to add those three permissions, give it a second to think, and they will appear here now. So there we go. So we've set up our permissions, our scopes. We'll call these scopes in a moment. But these are basically what now this application that we created, the REST API testing application, has permission to access these specific aspects of the Graph API, and that's it. So even though technically the Graph API enables you to work with the calendar, currently my application, the way it's been configured, would not. So if I want it to work with the calendar, I then have to go here, add permission, go find the calendar permissions and add those permissions. So as it stands today, right now, all I can work with is mail, and it's read, write, and send. So that would be the bulk of configuring and setting up the initial setup, okay? So let's now move over to the database side of things. Now, there's an issue, so I'm going to sort of do a little bit of a stop here and mention something. I have managed to get all of this working with my Microsoft E5 account. And that's basically more of a corporate account. Now, I did the exact same steps like I just demonstrated to you. And everything's configured correctly, but I cannot authenticate this user through my Access 2013. I have a feeling there's something there relating to using the standard web browser control, because there's errors that come up with the JavaScript. I then decided, okay, well, no big deal. I'll switch over to my MS365 Access. I'll use the modern browser, and then those JavaScript errors are no longer an issue and everything's glorious. However, when you work on MS365, you're a logged in user. When it goes to authenticate, it doesn't allow me to use this user anymore. I have to use the user for which access is logged in which case I can't validate this account anymore. So long story short, and don't ask me why there's a difference, but if you log in with an E5 account, the standard browser works just fine. The authentication, login, Microsoft pages all work flawlessly, no errors in JavaScript. The minute I try to use a standard account, then for some reason the HTML JavaScript errors, and I have no means currently to test it. Because in the standard web browser, you can switch users. However, when you're in the modern web browser, you cannot. The option is gone. So there's multiple issues here at the Microsoft level, because this is entirely Microsoft, has nothing to do with my setup or the code. This is entirely Microsoft. They have different setups depending on the type of user, and so there's no standardization, and you have no means of switching users when you migrate up to the modern web browser. So anyway, all this to say, it's been a very disappointing experience, and sadly I cannot test this specific user. So for moving forward, I'm going to revert now to using my E5 account, but the setup that I just demonstrated here on the Entra page is identical. I just don't want to show you confidential information at this point. That's all I'm coming down to say. But once you set this up, as long as this is the account that you're logged into, everything will work flawlessly. So let's get back to development. So you come here, like I said, and you simply put your client ID. And just to step back for 2 seconds in case you forget, you just click on Overview anytime you need it, and you can copy it from here, okay? So now you copy paste it here, and you are ready to roll. So now I'm just going to slowly go through the different modules very quickly, give you a refresher if you didn't see my previous video relating to the Google API. We're just going to run through this quickly, okay? So the reference material, that's exactly what it is. It's a series of websites and web pages that I thought could possibly be useful to you. A lot of this is already on the website. Encoding, we need this. We need to encode in base 64 content for JSON strings and things like that. We need to be able to do URI encryption, well, encryption hashing as well. HTTP, this is for sending and receiving the response back from server, so to Microsoft. So whenever we're trying to do any action, send an email, well, this is how it's done. We build up some type of request. So we open the specified endpoint URL, we give it the method, content type. We may have to pass along authentication information, so a token, and then we send our request, and we will then receive back this information, a code. So the code, it lets us know if it was successful or not. The response text, which is going to provide us the information, and that changes depending on what request you make. So when we're trying to authenticate, well, that will give us back something like a token, refresh token, when it expires. When we do other things like create an email, send an email, we'll get back, for instance, let's say the email ID, and then you could store that. That way you could interact with it again later if you needed to. You could read it, you could forward it, you could do, all sorts of things, but you need that information. So depending on the type of request, you get different responses back from the server, and you have to be able to extract what you need from those responses to do other things possibly, or store information. So an example, concrete example is, let's say we requested from Microsoft server, give me a listing of my appointments today. Well, the response would come back as a listing of, here are the different items in your calendar. So you might have different appointment IDs with subjects and content, and all of that's going to be in there. And then you have to break it down and extract what you need, depending on what you're doing. JSON. JSON is a specific language, and in certain scenarios with certain characters, we have to escape them because they have special meanings in JSON. So therefore, like double quotes. So here, a double quote is a special character, so we have to escape it. So long story short, we use this to escape strings, for instance, email body, let's say, to ensure that it's safe. We've looked at the Microsoft Outlook. This is the actual function for sending the email. This is what builds our request to Microsoft and then sends the request to the server, and then we wait to hear back from it. So it's very similar, but all it's doing here is it builds up the necessary JSON string, and then when we're all good and dandy, it sends that HTTP request that we just built, so the JSON string, it sends it to Microsoft server, and then if it comes back as a 200, everything is glorious, the email was sent. You'll see here for the content, so the email message itself, like I said, we're using that JSON escape function that we just saw earlier. The O2Auth. Authentication, this is what does the initial handshake with Microsoft to get an access token. That is the key to the kingdom. That's what allows us to actually make these different requests to the server. We need an access token for our actions to work. So if we don't supply the access token, no sending emails, all of that, nothing will work. There's different aspects to this. Unlike Google, Microsoft, at least from what I could find, I have been unable to find a check token endpoint or syntax, nor a revoke token. So I created my own check based on the expiration of the token, but it's not the same. But regardless, it does effectively allow me to still replicate what I did in Google. The refresh token, like I said, because tokens expire, they're not good indefinitely, we refresh them. So this is what that does. It's going to take our token and it's going to ask for basically a refresh, a new token, so we can continue to operate without always having to log in over and over and over. You have here loading credentials. So when I make that initial handshake and I get authenticated, and when Microsoft finally gives me that authentication token, I save that information to the table. And that's what this does here. It allows me to read it back into memory. So whatever was stored in the table, I can bring back into memory should there ever be a need to reinitialize variables and things like that. I have obviously the function to save it to the table. So when I do that initial handshake, I get my token, my expire in, etc. I take that information and I save it to the tables, and it's there for safekeeping. We have here to clear. So let's say I wanted to start over. I want to change my scope. I want to, whatever I'm trying to do. Sometimes it can be useful to just clear out everything from the table, from the global variables and things like that. So that's what this guy does here. Extract components. So this is for that initial handshake. I know the format that the response from the server is going to be. So this function simply goes through it, breaks it down, and extracts the different information. So I extract the scope, the access token, the refresh token, the token type, the expire in, and I also add a token creation date and time. That way I can calculate when it expires. That's what this next function does. It calculates when it expires based on the expires in and the token creation date and time. And then I just have a utility here that allows me to output the various variables just so I can see what's going on. Did they get saved? Did they not? Things like that. Self-healing object variable, pretty self-explanatory. I only have one currently. There, I could easily add more. And I probably will at a later date. For a performance standpoint, it's always beneficial. I started working on a modern browser, like I said, so we can always explore that at a later date, but currently it is not required using my E5 account. The email generator is very simple. It simply calls that function that we saw here under Microsoft Outlook, and we pass it the information from our form. That's it. So the authentication itself is really straightforward. This is all just following the standard documentation, but we're going to go to this URL. We're going to navigate to this URL, and we're going to add on all this information to the URL. So we're going to add all these arguments URL. So we have to supply it that client ID. That's why it's so important to have. We tell it to respond back with the code that it will do. We have to supply it the redirect URL, etc., and the scope. So the scope has to match, or has to at least be included in the APIs that we authorize online. So I specified offline access, mail read write, mail send. So these are the scopes I'm asking to access to. Now we could have defined online on our account 30 APIs, and my application here could only use 3. There's no issue. I don't have to include all of them. If I don't need those for whatever I'm doing, then I don't include them. But whatever we put as the scope when we're doing the authorization, we get the token from, that token is only going to be authorized on those specific scope items. So you have to make sure that you include in your scope whatever APIs you truly need to do what you're working on. So this is why for us today, for sending emails, this is the scope we need. So we're going to supply that. It's going to then navigate. It's going to, as long as it's successful, as long as we have the proper client ID, scope, things like that, and it's going to navigate, and it's going to then eventually try to redirect to this guy. Like I said, this won't work on my computer because it's not a web server. Therefore, it's going to generate an error. So it's going to run this code, in which case we're able to extract the code that Microsoft is going to return to us. Because remember up here, we're asking it to return to us the code. So it will. It will be part of the URL that it tries to redirect to. So it's going to be here, HTTP localhost, and then all sorts of other information after it, amongst other things, a code. So we're going to extract that code, and we're going to build a new request. This time, we're going to be asking for the authorization type. In which case, when this all happens, we'll return us a response that will include access tokens, access refresh tokens, the expire in, the critical information that we need. So I will get that back. I will extract the information. I will save it to the table. And once this is done once, initially, the system now will be ready and operational to do whatever we want, as many times as we want. So we have to do this initial authorization initially, but after that, we should be fine, because it should simply refresh the token behind the scenes without needing the user to log back in ever again. I have clients that have been running for 2 years, maybe even longer now, where we did this initial grant, it got a token, and it just simply keeps refreshing that token ever so often so they can continue to operate freely. So they're not even aware of any of this. And that's the beauty. So that's the basic gist of it. Once it's done here, I cancel the navigation just to stop the process. I display a nice message in the web browser to my user that everything worked and that it's going to close in 3 seconds. And I set the timer to close it in 3 seconds because the timer simply does a do command close. That is it. It really is that simple. So let's look at this in operation. If we launch the email generator, we simply come here, and it's a standard thing. You're just going to put the email address you want to send an email to. And obviously, this can be all just a function behind the scenes. Like, you don't need this interactive form. I just created it to demonstrate a little bit how it works. But you can easily have all of this and extract data from a table and just automatically send out emails. But for today, test REST API email, this, and let's use an HTML tag, a simple test. Let's close the tag. And you have options, the importance. Okay, let's make this high priority. It's an HTML message. Do we want to save it to the sent folder? It's an option with Microsoft, so you can say yes or no. So at this point, we simply press the send email. And, oh, it just opened the wrong window. Here you go. You will get a prompt to log in the first time. So you come here, you enter your password. You give it a second to do what it has to do. So I have to enter the code that Microsoft sends me. It won't be long. and it should finalize the authentication. And as you see, then it displays a message, everything worked, and the email went out. We can now look at the auth table if we wanted, or any of our variables, but as you can see, information was properly put in here, and I just received the email that I just sent out. So as you can see, everything comes through just fine. We get scope, access token, refresh token, when it was created, when it expires. So everything's working fine. And then we can go and we can change. I want to send a second email now. Okay, this is another simple test. This time we're going to make it just normal, and I don't need it to be saved in the sent folder. We'll send it, and as you can see, there is no more authentication. So now that we have an access token, we're simply able to keep using that same access token over and over as many times as we want, as long as this section stays alive. And that there is the basic general concept of using a REST API, and specifically the Microsoft Graph API, to send emails through Outlook using the Outlook APIs. So I hope this helps some of you. And you know, as long as you're configured and using the same account that you registered and set up your MS Access 365, then everything will work flawlessly. You won't encounter the type of problems that I did. There's still an issue there, and anytime you authenticate, typically you're able to switch the user, but for some reason, when you're using Access 365, that option has been removed. So I'm assuming, I think it's a modern browser issue again, but I don't know. It's definitely a Microsoft issue. I just don't know if it's specifically an Access issue. But there's a problem there, because we shouldn't, just because you're using 365, you shouldn't lose that ability to switch accounts, which we have. But regardless, it is what it is. This does work properly, as you can see, when you've got an account that works properly. So it's simple, and like I said, all of this stuff doesn't really change. What you're going to change if you want to add new functionality is you're going to want to change this function, or you're going to want to create new functions. You can create a function for Outlook to go read the inbox or any folder you want. You can do searches, and you can do filters, and you can specifically say, I want emails received between this day and this day. I want emails received from a specific person with this, word in the subject. You can do all sorts of things. All the capabilities are there. It's just a question, like I did here, of building the function to do it. So making this request, sending that request to the server, and then getting back the response and dealing with whatever the response might be. But it's always the same scenario. We build our request, and then we deal with the response back from the server. But once you've got all of this set up, the JSON, the HTTP, the auth, all you're going to be doing after that is adding new functions to, let's say, Outlook, or if you're working in Dynamic 365 functions. So none of the rest of this you're really going to have to play with ever again once it's set up in functional. So the only thing you need to do is go into the Microsoft and put your client ID, authenticate the first time, and after that everything's glorious. I hope this has been helpful and informative. Yeah, I do plan on trying to continue to look into interacting with different aspects of the Microsoft Graph API and the Google API. I think I'm going to delve into possibly reading a few emails, just demonstrating how that can be done. So how you can recover and read content from mailboxes. And then I guess perhaps play around with the calendar or contacts or notes and tasks, things like that. Yeah, so I'm going to stop here. If this has been even remotely interesting to you, I truly would appreciate the like, share, subscribe, yeah. Do keep in mind, this is an introduction into REST APIs. There are thousands and thousands of REST APIs out there. So you can take this and go and connect to other REST APIs. And that's the beauty of REST APIs. It really is something that's been used in web development for decades. So Microsoft Access, or what I'm showing you here, we're just more or less playing catch up. And with the changes coming to the new Outlook, this becomes interesting, because there are other avenues we can take. Let's say CDO mail, or let's say even switching over to Thunderbird, but they don't give us necessarily 100% flexibility or capacity. Like, you think of CDO mail, there's no way of saving the email when you've sent it. So saving it to the sent items. With this, you can. With this, you can go way beyond CDO mail. Like I say, you can interact with your contacts, with your calendars, and just things that you can't do any other means. So, this is truly a very viable and flexible and powerful technique. And yeah, I hope this has been useful to you guys. Anyway, wishing you all a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.